Joint work session meeting of the Ann Arbor City Council and the Downtown Development Authority. We are here to talk about all things parking. And unless there's further direction from Mr. Lazarus, I turn it over to the tender mercies of Ms. Pillay.
Oh, terrific. Well, I can't do a better topic than parking. It's actually my favorite topic. When I go to parties, but tonight, we're going to work our way through some work items. The first part of the meeting, we're going to talk about the parking agreement. There's topics that we're going to talk about that might change the agreement with amendments, so we'll talk about those. We're going to then talk about changes to the parking system, including additions and subtractions. We're going to talk a little bit about where the DDA is with the dialogue about changing parking rates, kind of the strategies that they're looking at, and at least tentatively what those rate changes might look like. And then we're going to talk about DDA projects. We're going to land on things like parking projects, streetscape projects. We're going to look at transportation projects and land on a page talking about economic development and what we might do together with the city. So with that, I'm going to walk ourselves through the PowerPoint. With me is my able colleague, Joe Morehouse, who is our Deputy Director, and in addition to being our Finance Director, also works with my other colleague here, Jada Halbrock, to oversee our parking system. So with that, let's see if we can get this thing moving. Page up, not moving. See if this thing moves. No, we are frozen. Let's see if we do it this way. Is that moving? Nope.
Go to next. Do you have your mouse and go up to next?
No, we are frozen. Sorry, everybody. Technical difficulties. Okay, let's go backwards. There we go. As always, Jada. Thank you. All right, so now we're up and running. So thank you all for your indulgence. We're going to start by just talking a little bit about the fact that the two agencies, the DDA and the city, share the same goals. We're working toward the quality of life in our community, the vibrancy of downtown, and of course we have to be mindful of the financial sustainability of both of our organizations. Tonight we're meeting because in part the parking agreement sets forward that we are to have an annual work session. So today is in keeping with that requirement. And as I mentioned, we're going to talk about changes to the agreement. There's some ideas that have come up in the course of the year, as well as changes to the parking system that are on the horizon, possible rate changes, and some discussion around our projects. So with this, the first part is the parking agreement. There are 4 essential areas that we're looking to discuss. The first is this year the DDA voted to increase the amount going to the city from gross parking revenues from 17% to 20%. And one element to talk about to modify the agreement would be to make this permanent. The agreement, the resolution rather that the DDA approved was a 2-year only change for this fiscal year and next fiscal year. So there's a question about making this a permanent change to 20%. Another question that we're going to talk about is coordinating parking fines, which is parking enforcement, and parking rates, which at this point are not necessarily in step. We'd like to talk with the city about examining some of its parking requirements under its zoning and then some miscellaneous changes. So with regard to the 17% shifting to 20%, as I said, the DDA looked at this and approved earlier this spring a 2-year change. What is being proposed is a permanent change. And to give you a sense of where this would take us, over the last few years, the amount coming out of the parking system has been a gross of about $3 million. Taking it to 20% would get us over $4 million. So making that a permanent change, of course, would show a greater amount going to the city overall. Another change that came up through discussions with the DDA Parking Operations Committee and with Operator is that our parking fines and our parking rates are out of sync. Last year, the DDA met with this body, and there was discussion about the DDA possibly taking over enforcement. And we'll touch on that a little later, but we're not pursuing it tonight. But what is being pursued is whether we could establish some kind of process that when rates are changed, we would also likewise change the fine amounts. Currently, they're out of step with each other. And just to give you a sense, the last time parking fines were modified, it was in 2010. And currently, if you took a ticket on the street and paid it that same day by the next business day, it's $10. Well, that's going to be cheaper than if you parked in the garages all day. Certainly, that doesn't make any sense if our goal is compliance. So what the amount is left at this point as an open question, whether it's some calculation of the rates or whatever it is. But the recommendation is that we put the two together, and so as rates change, so too parking fines would change. The third change that the DDA is recommending came forward out of a dialogue early this spring as we looked at whether or not the DDA needed a long-term parking policy for permits. And this question came up in light of some developments in the South U area, in particular because we heard that they didn't really want parking, but they were required to provide parking because of zoning. And so as a part of that dialogue, the DDA took a look at the city requirements and said that it may require some new deep dive. An example is each area has different opportunities as far as transit than the others. What South University might need for parking requirements might look very different than what you might want to set forward in Main Street. And just as we have character districts, perhaps the parking requirements, so too could be subtly different through the district. But they've set forward, and you'll see it in your packet, a set of ideas that could be explored. They're not asking that the council approve them, but rather that they be taken up as a dialogue at Planning Commission and at the city at some point this year. In particular, the parking in lieu requirement, which places stress on the city parking system to provide parking for projects in the downtown. And then the last one is just a series of miscellaneous topic areas. For instance, there's a requirement to have quarterly customer surveys. Well, we're finding that our customers are not responding to surveys. Every time you leave a shop, you're being asked to answer a survey. And so things like that requirement just needs to be tweaked. We're asking that we change things like the bid process. We just went through that. So changing the language in the document about that kind of thing. These are minor changes. The subtotal of the agreement, though, would largely stay the same. So back a step to those four topic areas. I don't know if you'd like to stop. I'll stop talking for a moment. If there's those on the DDA that would like to touch on these, others who want to bring forward any other ideas. As mentioned last year, I'll just finish, we had a dialogue about the DDA taking over enforcement. That's not on the table today. And also what's not on the table, at least not on this list, is whether or not the DDA would ask the city to change its enforcement hours. Under the agreement, that's something that the DDA is to ask the city to pursue. And as of today, the DDA is not specifically putting that forward. So I'll stop there, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about the parking agreement.
Okay, so first, can you just elaborate a bit on why that was abandoned?
So the DDA took a look at both of those things. I'll start with the parking enforcement. We had a retreat this spring, and it was an idea that I think the DDA wanted to explore. We as staff work with our colleagues at the city to look at what this might look like financially. And what we found that was pretty compelling is the city needs to retain all of the revenues it currently receives from enforcement. And if the DDA were to take over the task of enforcement, we would be gaining a new expense of about $1 million, maybe $1.5 million a year without those revenues. And so to ensure that the city doesn't lose any of those revenues, and so the DDA doesn't take on any new expense, it didn't really make financial sense for the DDA to take over enforcement.
So looking at it from the city side, not to say that you're not, but if you would absorb the cost of parking enforcement, that would be dollars, general fund dollars for the, to pay for something else. And I think that would have been a significant financial benefit to the city. So if the parking enforcement's not being transferred, that does place the DDA in a better financial situation than it otherwise would have been. Did the DDA consider, when you decided not to pursue this at this time, increasing the city's parking revenue shares to a higher percentage than 20%? Because I think, just in the broader context, I mean, if you look at your TIF revenue, again, has grown by 75% over the last 5 years, and the city's has grown by a little over 10%. So, again, this would have been a financial benefit to the city. So were other things considered in lieu of that?
Again, what you see in front of you is a distillation of a lot of dialogue, going back to the retreat and subsequent committee meetings afterwards. I don't know if there's members of the board who'd like to talk a little bit about the enforcement question in particular. The discussion, I think, certainly got a lot of dialogue in a few meetings. Yeah, Bob.
Well, I think it's safe to say the DDA was interested, and in some ways there was a positive part to that in terms of a unified system, and without criticizing the city, I think we thought we could have maybe done a better job also, and a more friendly job, which may be hard to pull off. But the financial part of it was just too much, I think, for us, Jane. We have a lot of other things. You're looking at an increased percentage on an ongoing basis from parking revenue. And we'll talk about it later, I think we need more parking downtown, and that's going to cost us, and we have capital improvement projects going for the next several years. So it was a financial decision primarily.
And again, from the city side of the table here, again, not to imply that you're not looking at that, it's just, it would have been a financial benefit for the city. So I appreciate your explanation.
And I think there's still opportunity to discuss it. The city's financial structure can be a bit complicated to understand at times, and unraveling things can take a little bit of time. I think there was some misunderstandings, some internally, about which assets, specifically personnel, we would keep and want to be funded for, and which ones would be absorbed into the parking.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's still room for discussion on it. We need to do a little bit better job of clarifying what the costs are. Our intent was to keep enough of the parking enforcement to do the community standards enforcement, and then we wouldn't need all the staff that were there. And I think there's just, I don't think it was ready for decision internally yet, but I do think it's something we can continue to talk, so that in the future, it can be, if DDA still has the interest, it can be done with the financial aspects mitigated, and the city can repurpose some of the resources to do some other things. So we're not going to give up on it. It's just not quite ready
tonight.
right now.
How much did we net in parking enforcement?
I'm sorry, is it revenues and
I just wanted to know in terms of
Tickets.
tickets.
There's approximately 2.7 million generated through tickets, of which about 300,000 is used for ticket processing, for about a net of, what is that, 2.4?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I'm glad that we're still potentially pursuing that conversation about different enforcement possibilities. I get the impression that doing customer service friendly things like first time ticket forgiveness and that kind of thing, and overall more holistic management is not impossible with the city, but maybe more possible with cooperating with Republic or funding it that way. So, that's something I would really like to pursue. We don't want to be punitive. We want compliance, and I think being able to be flexible with first-time visitors and so on is a great benefit. are there next steps for pursuing that conversation, or is it just on pause for the foreseeable future?
No, I think we can continue to have a discussion, make a better financial case as it benefits both entities. We just hadn't gotten there yet.
Okay. And I guess for my part, I would expect it to be a fair exchange, taking on the costs of that. It'd be interesting to see if the costs were less expensive than the city doing it. And for that, I think the DDA should be made whole. So I guess it'd be nice if it were a gift, but if it's not possible, let's talk money.
There are a lot of moving I'll just say there's a lot of moving parts to this. There are the overall revenue picture. We hadn't reached decision about hours of enforcement at that point in time. Susan talked a little bit about increasing fines to keep up with increases in rates. So we need to start unraveling that and fixing things one point at a time. The first being the making permanent the increase in revenues to the city, and then building upon that. I think Susan will get into this, looking at the parking inventory going forward, and then that'll impact revenues. There's been some pushback and resistance about increasing hours of enforcement as well. So all those things we need to take both at the same time, but also look at it step by step to start taking some of the degrees of freedom off the table.
Yeah, there was likewise a robust discussion about the hours of enforcement at the DDA. I know that that's certainly not something that's popular with everyone, but as our economy keeps shifting, it's something that we need to keep an eye on. Our downtown economy looks very different than it looked 20, 30 years ago. There's a lot of businesses operating in the evening, and that therefore a lot of employees that need a way to get to work, and it's really worth a discussion how we help to get them to work and not displace the customers that are the reason the business is existing. We just haven't really quite found our way to what that would look like, what the hours would look like, when a change would happen, and so forth. Increasingly, nighttime transportation options keep growing. So, and as an example, is the ATA routes have now extended to 11. Night ride is very robust. A lot of people using that shared taxi after the fixed route service ends. Those are just two examples, Uber and Lyft and so forth. Yeah.
So in terms of the proposed changes for the parking agreement, I'm obviously comfortable with number one. In terms of changes to parking fine, I think it makes sense to look at them. The idea that was put on the table last year in terms of having an escalator, I think makes sense. I don't want to surprise somebody's first visit with Ann Arbor with a high parking fine, but if for repeated offenders, I think it should escalate. And I think that would be something that, if possible, to work in whoever's doing the enforcement. I'd like to see. As we look at changes to the parking requirements, I think that is absolutely something that could use a deeper dive. There's been a lot of discussion around the use of payment in lieu and how it's maybe necessary in one place but not necessary in another. I think for the Collegian North development, I was really glad we had that option on the table, because I think that block would have been significantly degraded if we had to put a curb cut on that block to allow for parking on site. So there are places when I think it makes sense, but there are other places where I think, so I think that's something that does merit a deeper dive. But we'll have a lot more to say when we get into the supply and what's happening in terms of some of our other TDM options and pricing issues.
And just sort of on that line, one of the things we learned with the Collegian, we make allowances for a Zipcar, for instance, to be used as some of the parking for a downtown project. In speaking with Maven and Zipcar and some of the national transportation agencies, 4 cars is just the minimum. They're actually looking at maybe 12, 13, 14 cars being taken off a road by having a Zipcar. So that's one of the tweaks that we could make in our zoning, to have a requirement, but then allowing a shared use car to provide that parking would be a more innovative way of providing parking to the residents of that building.
Two slides before this. Possible changes. Oh, no, sorry, not that one. counted this as number 9. Yeah,
Is it that one or ahead of that one?
the 9. Possible changes to the number 3. City reviews its parking requirements under zoning, that one.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I'm just wondering what happened to the change that said you can't use space in the public system to meet the requirement? Because that was a recommendation we had, that was proposed previously.
Yeah, I think that's exactly, I think we're talking about the same thing, that bringing back, maybe through planning commission, a revisiting of our CIL contracts, where a project could in fact use the public.
CIL, sorry.
This is the contribution in lieu
Oh.
provision. And some sites just don't really allow themselves to be used for parking, which is what that was intended. But I think revisiting this, given some of the projects we've seen, I think I think all share a goal of taking another look at that to see if in fact we're accomplishing what we need to with what's on the books.
So if private developers are going to, for CIL, use the public system, something like the downtown library lot, we are eating into the public stock of parking, and then we come around and then we are going to use taxpayer dollars to build it anyway. So I'm wondering whether actually we are shifting modes here, or are we just shifting the burden from private developer building parking structures for their needs, shifting it from private sector to public sector. I don't have the article right now, but I just was reading, there were 2 professors at University of California, Davis, I believe, have done this study looking at the big cities, even when people are switching and using call taxis, they saw no significant difference in car ownership. So you might call an Uber or use a temporary, but in terms of statistically significant, they were looking at both the groups and they said there was no. So that's another issue we might want to think about. You're in a traffic, you don't really want to drive or whatever reason. But I don't know if we have actually done away with car ownership. So that was another thing I really did want. So I'm really interested to know, by shifting the burden from private sector to using public parking, are we actually not building, or are we just shifting the burden?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and you're spot on. I think the data needs to be there. Just one bit of data that was important for me to anyway was 2 years ago when we did the Nelson Nygaard study. They looked at 2:30 in the morning through the parking system, and at that point we had 5,500 downtown residents. They found less than 1,000 cars parked overnight, and that included all the cars in the 4th and William garage for Air Ride. So that's a very significantly very small number of cars in the garages for the number of residents that we have. So that's one way of looking at it, is people that are living downtown to some greater extent than perhaps they might in the suburbs are choosing to live with fewer cars. They might use Zipcar, they might use the transit system. They can walk to class or walk to work, ride their bike. The multimodal downtown, at least as we could see from these studies, is working for downtown residents to not necessarily each resident needing their own car. So that's one point of data, but you're right on. I think we need more data around what the actual demand is.
I know we're still wanting to collate the data on downtown parking habits among residents and some of the new, more recent construction. Is it your sense that these developers would like to build more parking for their residents, or would they prefer to do less in that their residents are not demanding parking spaces?
Well, we have at least one developer here in the DDA group that, maybe we'll ask Darren to help weigh in. From what we have seen, there are different kinds of developments. There are rentals versus condominiums. There are some that are targeting, just different groups, and so the parking for each would be different. Overall, though, we're not seeing developers bringing 2 and 3 car spaces per a project, even those that are bringing parking. And many are bringing only just a few spaces for the number of residents in the building. Darren, I don't want to tap you, but you know more than many of us here.
Generally speaking, across many different types of developments, you're always looking to limit your costs, right? So if you're building parking, you're building a bigger building, a more expensive building, and it takes longer. So you're adding to the risk of the project, because there's significant risk in any real estate development. That being said, you have to get it financed. And the bank is going to ask you, how are you going to park this? So depending on the use, the bank will look for different ratios. If it's residential, meaning, you know, I'll call it single family, multifamily, if that's a term, or student, there's different ratios. Or if it's office or if it's retail, there's all kinds of, you know, the bank will want different things. So how you achieve satisfying the bank, be it through building your own or leasing it, or however you can work it out, as long as you can satisfy the bank, then that's all the developer really cares about at the end of the day. But minimizing risk is also a big thing too. So if you can sign a lease with the DDA and achieve all the parking you need to satisfy your lender, that's going to be your preferred route.
That's helpful. So for many of the recently completed, primarily student-oriented projects, we still force them to park the premium portion of the building. Have a lot, I don't recall the statistics offhand. Do have a lot of those developers wanted to do even more for those student projects, more parking?
I'm not aware, I don't know enough to know that they have.
I wouldn't see somebody wanting to build more parking than their lender required, or they, through their market research, have determined is necessary.
So their customers, their future tenants are not really chomping at the bit for parking spaces?
Not in a student high-rise, no.
Not in a
I
student
mean,
high-rise.
you're going to be able to get away with saying, all right, it's a 4-bedroom unit, you get 1 parking spot, you guys figure it out.
Okay. And so is it safe to say that by forcing the developer to build parking for those units above and beyond what they might deem necessary, that's adding to the overall rents and costs of the building? Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah. And it has also has an effect that at least we had some dialogue about in our committee, which is, for instance, in Southview, it's a very congested location. There are a lot of cars, and adding more cars just didn't seem like that made a lot of sense. That there's an area where if we could only encourage more bike use, more walking, more transit, it would be better for the neighborhood. So again, taking a neighborhood by neighborhood approach to parking requirements seemed to be a much more, I don't know, skillful way of approaching that question. Yeah.
So on the next slide,
Yeah.
the last item is suggestion that we remove section 7 from the agreement, which requires a competitive bid for management of the parking. Can you explain your thinking
You
there?
want to talk about that?
We just went through the process, and we're in total agreement with competitive bidding, but I think there were some items in there that were just onerous to the process, and that's what we would like to work out.
So you're not talking about removing the entire section, but just tinkering with the language that's in there?
Correct.
Okay. And can you tell me what it was that seemed onerous at the time?
Sure.
You want to come over?
There were sections that spoke to publicizing it, and I think it actually said a printed newspaper. It spoke to capital improvements, which is separate from, what our parking operator does. So it was just small tweaks around the edges that need to be updated, given that that language was from, 20 years ago, when the way that you handle a bid process was different.
Thank you.
Just a couple quick follow-ups. Following up on Councilmember Westfall's exploration of parking demand, student units, the contribution in lieu really came up in depth when we dealt with the Arbor Blue project. Has there been any data now that it's built and rented out in terms of how many of the spots that they've purchased in the forestry parking structure are being used by residents? Do we know any of that?
Do we know anything about the Arbor Blue parking permits? Are they all in use?
by residents of the development?
Yes. They are being, billed monthly to Arbor Blue, and I think some of the parking in lieu agreements have clauses where they need to rent them to tenants of their building, so.
And then you mentioned the Nelson Nygaard study. Well, we're talking about downtown residents. There, one of the recommendations was a Go Pass program for residents. Has that moved forward at all?
No, we haven't taken big steps on that. We're still trying to get our hands around some of the other elements of that set of recommendations. What that would look like is anybody who lived downtown would have an option of getting a bus pass. We haven't had a chance really to delve into it too deeply. What makes it more challenging is a good amount of our residents downtown are students of U of M who likely have a U of M card, and sort of teasing out what's the delta between those that already have a card and how do you ensure that they stay in the hands of the person for whom it's intended. A little easier with an employer to manage those cards. We haven't quite gotten into it deep enough to understand how to manage it once it's released, say, to a property owner, to make sure it stays with those tenants and doesn't just migrate away. All right, well, we're moving on. So the next section we're going to talk about are changes to the parking system. The first is to talk about, in addition to the Ann and Ashley garage, we're going to talk about then some lot removals that are happening this year, and then also some upcoming lot removals into the future. For those of us that have been around since the early 80s, and I include myself, the Ann and Ashley garage was built at the same time as the One North Main building. And at the same time it was built, it was designed to carry the weight of at least 3 more floors. So after some dialogue about does downtown need more parking, and if so, where, at our retreat this year, the DDA board came to general consensus that if we were to pursue the addition of parking, it made most sense to add to the Ann and Ashley garage, at least for a few reasons. The first is it's probably the fastest and the easiest. It was designed for it. We already have the footings and the foundation and the elevators there. So we're in essence just expanding what we already have. The second reason for it is the western half of downtown is currently an area of opportunity that the DDA is exploring ways to encourage the redevelopment. There are large surface lots that will be, one day we hope, new buildings of some kind. And the DDA is looking at streetscape improvements in that area, including potentially, we're exploring the feasibility down the road of restoring two-way traffic on First and Ashley, but also pedestrian improvements. First and Ashley don't have the pedestrian amenities that most downtown streets have. So adding the parking to that neighborhood would complement the streetscape improvements that the DDA is going to pursue, again, with hopes of redeveloping those lots, having the private sector see it as an opportunity. The parking garage expansion likely could be built as fast as, say, the next 18 months. The DDA would work with its engineers over the next 4 months or so to develop the construction drawings, go out to bid next summer, and the construction, we understand, would take somewhere between 12 to 14 months to build. That would likely add at least 375 spaces, although we've asked the engineers to explore if in fact we can get more. As long as we're there, what would be the maximum you could get? The second question we're asking them to explore is, as long as we're there, is now the time to build out the retail area that faces onto Ashley. It was designed at some point for some kind of commercial use, and now would be a good time to explore actually building that out as rough space, and the city could then sell it as a condominium unit of some kind. As long as we're there, also exploring the expansion of the electrical capacity to add a whole lot more electric vehicle charging units in that garage. And of course, adding the pedestrian barrier fencing, not only on the roof, but on some of the lower levels. So that's underway. This is a garage that fills up every day. So roughly estimating, just using the existing spaces and the existing revenues, we're expecting that this might generate as much as perhaps another $900,000 a year, which at 20% would generate, almost $200,000 more for the city. So that is under discussion. When it comes forward to the city, we would need the city's help to issue a bond, a revenue bond for this project, so there'll be more dialogue about it. And we're, again, likely to see this coming to you probably in the next 4 to 6 months. That's happening at the same time as 2 lots that have been in public use for a while will be going away from the public system. We've had leases for the Fifth and Huron and the First and Huron lots for a while. First and Huron goes back to Mayor Brown, who had a car dealership on that site. And then it was used for public parking, and as buildings on that site were demolished, the parking was expanded. And when the DDA took it over in the 90s, all but 1 building had been eliminated, and that was what many of you remember as the day shelter. And then that too, because of deterioration, was removed, and now it's an entirely vacant lot. The cost to the public system would be approximately $500,000 in revenues, and that, of course, then represents a loss to the city also in revenues. And that would happen at the end of this month. The leases are ending at the end of this month. I don't know, Howard, if you want to speak at all to what may happen with the lots after November 30th?
Well, there are some zoning considerations that have to be addressed to bring those lots into compliance. We've asked the owner to submit certain requirements on how they will bring the lots into compliance, and we're working hopefully collaboratively with them. It's not our intent to shut the system or shut those lots down while they're working towards full compliance, because the availability of the parking, although it's not a public asset, serves a public benefit. We believe we can do that administratively, but I've asked the city attorney to review to make sure that if there is a council action required, we comply with that as well. So as long as there are good faith efforts to continue to move forward, then it's in the public interest to keep those spaces available.
So that's in the short term. In a slightly longer term, as many of you know, the tree line master plan is moving its way toward the city council for approval. Just at its last meeting, the DDA voted to approve a resolution of support for the tree line. So something that had been a concept is now becoming more real. And so it's worth noting, as long as we're talking about lots going away, that 2 of the city lots will likely be going away sometime in the future. Not sure exactly how long. One of them is the 415 West Washington lot, which was taken on as a temporary lot when the maintenance facility was closed. And the other is First and William, which is at the base of William Street, which many of us use when we come downtown. Both of those together would be about 261 spaces going away. And it's just something to be thinking about, higher, better uses of those properties than parking lots, but again, parking that's serving our downtown. So again, in light of the potential addition to Ann and Ashley, it's worth noting that in the short term, we're likely to see yet more lots going away.
The master plan for the tree line is scheduled to come to council in December. It's always been the intent, along with that, to bring a business plan from the Conservancy to show how it would in fact build parts using a combination, a stew of funding, public as well as private funding. So part of what you'll see when those come together is the plan for development of 415 West Washington and how those revenues would support both the capital investment in the trail as well as the ongoing maintenance.
Is that what, is that what you mean by using a portion of the TIF that's generated by that project for, I wasn't sure what was envisioned there.
I haven't seen the business plan yet, so I don't know the specifics of the
Well,
numbers.
it's there on the last slide that we're,
yeah.
Sorry.
No,
I'm
I
jumping ahead,
appreciate
but
that.
There's one on economic development.
Oh, yeah, that's it, though. Yep.
Yeah. And it just references using the TIF generated from 415 West Washington for the tree line project.
Well, there's a question mark after that, so it's certainly
I
something.
wasn't sure what was envisioned, yeah.
It's something, again, I haven't seen how the finances work, but it's something that when we bring it back to council, you'd have to consider whether you want to do it or not.
Right. And then when it does come back, it would be helpful to understand what the process would be to do something like that.
Agreed.
Because we haven't done that. Where we've designated as, TIF from a property or project for something specific like that. I mean, the TIF in general, but not.
No, I agree, I agree. And I think, we've asked the Conservancy to look creatively at how to fund the project. And I think as we go forward, it's something council will consider whether they support it or not.
Yeah.
So it is different, I know that.
I'm just saying, yeah, it would be helpful when that time comes to understand how this is done.
Absolutely agree.
So I've landed on a slide just to sort of give you a snapshot of all three things. The addition to Ann and Ashley, and the reduction of 2 lots immediately and then 2 lots in the future. We're still showing a negative, even with the addition of Ann and Ashley. And there's, of course, a revenue impact to both agencies. Again, that was one of the things we talked about. When the board met in June to talk about, if not Ann and Ashley, where else could we build it, there are not that many city-owned properties where this could take place. We explored potentially adding to the Liberty Square garage that was designed for an addition. That's a very challenging site. Enormously challenging too for the patron because there's only one way in, and it's a giant corkscrew. Very unpleasant experience. Most of the garages were not designed for any additions. Really, the last remaining big site might be in the future the Klein lot underneath the South Ashley parking lot. We explored at least initially what that could look like underground and also under the street, as we did with Library Lane. It's really expensive, so it's not something that you'd want to take on until you know what you want to put on top. If you remember what the costs of Library Lane are, at least at initial costs for Klein lot were probably more like $90,000 a car space. So when the time comes and there's a project that the city wants to see on top, that's probably the time you're going to want to trigger that one. But other than that, there's really not a lot of locations, other than if a private developer were to come to the DDA and say, would like you to build with us. Really, Ann and Ashley is our best shot at this point, adding to the system. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that.
Part of the reason I asked Susan to include this chart is there's a lot of discussion over the future of, we don't know, and I think Ms. Kalasapathi's point is well taken, we don't know whether movement towards self-driving cars is going to move away from private ownership of cars. You know, I don't know that I personally bought into the argument that people won't want to have their own vehicle, even though it self-drives. But this does show that there's a need, at least in the short term, to replace spaces that we're going to lose. So while parking garages are a long-term investment of funds for what may be a use that is of less duration, we don't know that. But at the very least, we do need to replace over the short term what we're going to lose. And that's what hopefully the table shows, that it kind of breaks even from a revenue standpoint, but there is a net loss of over 100 spaces, even adding those to the inventory. So it's critical, in my mind, that we go ahead with the addition just to try and keep some of the inventory current. Now, it does assume a loss of the first in Huron, fifth in Huron, which will go into private hands. You know, downtown property is valuable. Surface parking is probably not the highest and best use. So I think it's prudent to assume that the owner is going to want to develop those properties as well.
Sorry, I appreciate your presenting this slide. And I look at these numbers and I see that even with, you know, the addition at Ann Ashley, the system falling by 100 spaces, that's concerning. And, you know, couple that with the Nelson Nygaard, you know, parking demand growth estimate, they said, you know, 860 spaces by 2019. And, okay, in the meantime, we're allocating 360 at the library lot. So I think it would be wise to consider other capacity actions beyond Ann Ashley. So thanks for that.
To follow up, also from the Nelson Nygaard, though, it said all deficits could be offset by achievable mode shift and don't build to meet projected demand deficit. That was before that deficit, that 860 deficit wasn't including these. I do agree that the expansion of Ann Ashley makes sense. I also want to make sure that we do look at those other mode shift pieces that are in the Nelson Nygaard report, and we keep looking at the full suite of options, not just building capacity. It's a necessary part, but I don't think it's sufficient. Regarding the use of the lots as private parking, I have a bit of a concern on that if it becomes a long-term process. I think that there's a reason that our D1 zoning doesn't list parking as an approved primary use. So I think if it's a transition while other things are in process, I guess I can deal with it. We took the council was, and the DDA took a fairly hard stance on that when we looked at the Y lot. I think we should be consistent regardless of ownership. I don't think we should be playing favorites with that. We looked very seriously about what it means to not be competing with ourselves, and I think we should have a similar approach. And I think we should be consistent with our zoning to make sure that we're not letting in a primary use that we don't actually want, taking up a lot of our streetscape.
I don't know if it was Don Shoup or somebody else who said that if something's too cheap, you never have enough of it. So I'm concerned that we're reflexively turning to capacity when, I guess, relative to some peer cities that have been highlighting these reports, we're underpricing parking. So I'm concerned about the order in which we are looking at capacity. Do we have a solid understanding of the sort of elasticity of demand as it relates to pricing? And is there has there been any discussion of going in that direction and seeing what the impact on capacity is before we invest money that we'll never get back?
So I don't know if this is the perfect segue, because the very next topic is parking rates. So maybe with your permission, we'll take a shift going forward. The DDA has, as you know, this tool. It calls it the 10-year plan. We take a look at rates, and we look at TIF, and we look at expenses and capital costs for about the next 10 years. And in our 10-year plan, we had envisioned a rate change in fiscal year 19, but because of the Ann and Ashley addition, we've started looking at rate changes a little sooner. Our Finance Committee and Operations Committee both took a look at it, and they've landed on some strategies for how to approach this that I thought were worth pointing out before we get into what the rates are. The first is to change from what we've been currently doing, which is saving ourselves up every few years and then making a rate change. And then it tends to be a bigger rate change. Instead, like so many other things, just have a small change every year. Just a small change, and it's like a non-event. So that would be a shift. A second one is we are aware that at least some of the demand on our permit wait list is because we've been pricing permits so much cheaper than parking by the hour. And so even those that aren't parking all day would rather get a permit, because coming with that permit is not only a cheaper price, but it's a guaranteed parking space. So over the course of the next few years, to reduce the differential between paying to park by the hour and paying to park by permit, that just seems to make sense to that point about demand. The third is we had at one point a TDM strategy where demand management strategy, where we had higher prices for permits in some quadrants of the city and less expensive costs in other parts of the city. And what we're finding is the demand for permits is great all over. So get them to a point where all the permit rates are exactly the same. That just doesn't make sense to be so tricky and complicated. And then last but not least, continue to expand the differential between what it costs to park on the street and what it costs to park in the garage. I mean, everybody would want to park on the street. The analogy, of course, is the airport. We all want to be at the curb, or we all want to be in short-term parking. But some of us have to go to the longer-term parking, or sometimes a shuttle, or sometimes leaving our car behind and taking a bus in. Well, the same is true with the cost to park on street versus in the garages. The more we can encourage and incentivize someone to park off-street, the more we free up those metered spaces for the occasional visitor for whom they don't know where the other garages and the lots are. So those 4 strategies, again, more regularly taking on rate changes with smaller rate changes, but more regularly taking them on. Again, reducing the differential between the permits and paying by the hour, evening out the cost for permits, and expanding the differential between paying on-street and off-street. Those kind of shape the dialogue in the 2 committees. What we're looking at least at this point, is still an early part of the discussion, so it's really helpful to have the council weigh in. We're considering raising rates 4th quarter in the fiscal year, so this would be April or so. We're looking at changes in the permits. Depending on how the rates are for the existing permit, it might be as little as $10 or it might be as much as $35 a month. The rate on street, we're looking at maybe an annual increase of 10 cents an hour on street. And through all of this over the next many years, we keep the rates to pay by the hour in the garages exactly the same. So it's $1.20 today, it'd be $1.20 even a few years from now. So that enables people to know that there's always a less expensive alternative. So at least initially, this is where the thinking has been. Not that this drives it, but just to give you a sense, if we were to put these forward, because we'd be in the last quarter of this fiscal year, there really wouldn't be much impact financially this year. Next year, it would be an increase of about 2.5%, which might generate about $500,000, of which the city would get 20%. And then the year after, it goes up still more. So just to give you a sense of what those revenues might generate. What we have seen to the question about demand is so often it's not the cost of the parking, but ensuring our patrons have a space to park in when they get there. And the other is a concern about a ticket. You know, nobody likes that experience. So as much as we can encourage people to park off street, it reduces the chance of a ticket. It ensures that the spaces up front, in front of the restaurant, in front of the Arc, in front of the Michigan Theater, are available for patrons who may not know their way around town. It helps us to accomplish goals even as we're meeting the parking demand. We'll leave it here, again, just to elicit if some people would like to talk about those particular rate changes or the strategies, just to get your thoughts.
The next slide again. So I'm confused by this slide. Yeah, that shows the year-by-year revenue impacts of the parking rate increases. Does the 4.8% and the 1.25 million that you show for fiscal year 20, does that mean that there would be a 4.8% increase in rates that year, or is that some sort of cumulative effect?
That's the cumulative effect.
It is, okay. It wasn't clear to me if the rates would be increased by 4.8% that year, and you were saying that the recommendation was to increase rates by about that much every year, which certainly seems excessive, obviously. So you're saying it's the cumulative effect?
Cumulative effect.
Okay. Yeah, I was confused by that slide.
Yep.
Okay.
I completely agree with the differential between the on-street and structure. I mean, I think it's some old data I saw. I think there's an excellent argument to be made. We're underpricing structure, and we're far underpricing on-street. I guess I find that 10% increase in on-street to be really conservative. You know, and as you said, it's about availability. People want to know that spots are going to be available. If you want to park on street, it's likely you're going to be there for a shorter time, and a lot of cities have had great success with that. You want a spot free on every block, and you price it accordingly. I'm not sure a less than 10%, increase is going to get us there. So I'm curious at how that was arrived at.
So these are initial ideas. These are not set in stone. Staff, using the strategies, put forward some ideas to consider. There wasn't a quest to gouge, or it was meant to try to keep these as moderate changes. So it'd be really helpful to get some feedback if it seems too low that no one really would notice the difference between that and the off-street. I mean, that's really helpful feedback. Again, the goal is to try to encourage people to be aware of their options, and if the differential between spending $1.70 on street and $1.20 in the garage is not enough of a differential to make a difference, I mean, that's helpful feedback. Because that's what that would look like.
Yeah, I think that's extremely, I just think it's really conservative, and it ties in with my last comment about, putting that kind of investment into additional spaces, and I have some questions about how those rates were arrived at for the construction costs. But I think we need to press on every available option. Go Pass has been a huge success. Night Ride is a huge success. I mean, to know how many structures those have saved us from building, to think if we just pushed on those a little bit more, made those more available, to see what happens, get our rates on par with peer cities, we might find we have plenty of capacity. I'm very hesitant about spending that much on additions before trying some pricing adjustments.
Councilmember.
I think we'd be remiss, though, if we didn't raise the issue that what we haven't addressed is increasing hours of enforcement in a way to promote turnover, because you'll never make garage parking competitive after 6 o'clock if you're not charging for it. So I think that has to remain a subject of discussion, and it may be something council chooses to pursue separately, because when you talk about undervaluing it as an asset, we are charging nothing for a prized asset during the hours it's coveted the most. So I would be remiss if I didn't bring that up.
Yeah, and I wanted to comment more on that before we shifted gears into this part of the conversation. I mean, there's the list of Michigan cities that do charge at night for on-street parking is, it seems like we're in the minority in terms of the larger cities. It's basically a nonprofit lottery for restaurant workers. I mean, and we've really gone out of our way to do off-peak permits to help employees. I think I'm not sure how many are aware of it or are taking advantage of it. I'd be curious if you have any information on that. But we've got a great program to help folks with off-peak parking, and it's extremely inexpensive. And I think giving away nighttime parking on street is not in our best interest, and it's not good for the businesses because it's not customers parking there.
Councilmember Orpahowski.
The other question that I have is, I think a lot of people don't know how much cheaper it is in the lots than it is on street. So I also wonder if we should be looking at a way to better make that price differential transparent, even if it's just a price sticker on every e-pay kiosk to say, meter rate or whatever we decide to call it, in the lots it's only this rate. I think we can change the rates, and people who are occasional visitors or who are pricing, I don't think I think people think parking is parking to a large extent, and only not everybody who would change their behavior based on that information knows that information. That said, I agree with moving the rates slowly and sort of sticking. I think it's going to help get acceptance. And my fear is if we tried to move too quickly, we might run into a very vicious backlash that would push us back and freeze us where we are, rather than trying to use the pricing as one of the tools to try to adjust the overall demand management.
I was looking at my phone at the ePark app, which is great, right? It's really easy, but it also does encourage that parking on the street in some ways. And is there a way that you've thought about where you merge the technologies between the on-street and the structure, so that one could maybe see the difference between the two costs?
We would like to very much, but none of the manufacturers of parking equipment in the garages have such a thing yet.
Okay.
And unfortunately, the off-street and on-street systems are incompatible technologies, so you can't merge them.
Because it's a wonderful, I don't want you to take it away. It's fantastic. And the couple, I usually walk short with a couple of times that I had to drive sort of for half a day to get somewhere else. It's been a wonderful asset. But I know that we've talked about having a step where you can, see where the parking capacity is in the city, and it would be great to be able to see it all and be able to cost it out that way.
I think it happens that when we're interviewing the operators, part of what was interesting was talking about technology and where things are. And I've been one of the people that have been concerned about taking on enforcement, because in my mind, to run a kinder, happier system, technology could do a lot, but the technology isn't really quite there yet to really integrate, between on-street, parking structures, enforcement, all those things. Once we get to a point where people can, easily understand the system, know what their choices are and all those things, in my mind, that would be the time that you could look at an integrated system effectively. But until then, in my mind, it's a pretty bootstrap kind of an approach you wind up taking.
One thing that's interesting about the ePark app is old timers like me don't whip out the credit card that often, but it is apparent a lot of people use credit cards for even 30 cents. They'll just put that credit card. But the app allows you to pay as much as the space allows. So if the space is a 4-hour space or a 3-hour or 2-hour, you just hit that option and you've paid for it. And it doesn't hurt quite so much as when you have to lug around that bag full of quarters. And so it's a different equation when you're changing rates, and you don't feel it the same way as when you're actually putting quarters into a machine. So that psychology is a changing one.
So the current parking revenue is more than sufficient to cover our current costs. That's right? Have we considered offering free parking structure parking spaces in the evening? So to encourage people to park other than on the street?
So I'll take a shot and then I'll let my colleague join me. We haven't, in some part because, like Don Shoup and others, we believe all parking has a value. And that offering free devalues it. That, in fact, it's not that the value of it is less than the value of something else, but by making it free, you're in essence saying it. We're saying that with on-street parking after 6. We're saying don't move your car, park all evening, but it doesn't really have a value because it's free. And so as we've explored in the garages, making that free, at least at this point, it hasn't jived with a set of values, which is it's a community asset. It is filling up. It's not as if the garages don't have a lot of patrons. So why make it free if you're not managing on-street at the same time? There's a disconnect in that. I don't know if you want to answer better than that.
I guess all I'd like to say is, while the current revenues pay for the parking operation, there are other demands on the parking system, such as the contribution for the Go Passes and the bonds being paid and all of that. That's 20% to the city. So at the end, there is no great excess revenues left at the end of the year.
Okay. One last question. I understand that parking meters on the street are to encourage turnover. And I've been in other cities where they offer you the first half hour at a meter for free. And that seems to serve the same purpose. You spin the dial, it gives you half an hour for free. You go in and you pay your ticket or whatever your business downtown is, and you go out and you move along. Have we looked at any technology that would allow that sort of thing, where the initial short-term visit would be for free, but then thereafter you'd have to pay?
No, we haven't, but that's an idea definitely to explore.
Thanks.
Just a request, just in terms of the parking rate increases, it would be nice if you could just provide us a summary of the parking rate increases over the last 10 years or so.
Sure.
Thanks.
I just had a question, or wondered if this was relevant at all. When I met with Jim Kostiva, he said that U of M's parking structures are free in the evenings, after 6, as long as they aren't related to Hill Auditorium or something. So I was just wondering if you guys had knew, it was a surprise to me, so I wasn't sure you were aware of that also.
Yeah, many of them in the downtown, for instance, Church Street, I think is often offered for free. The garages that are located, like Thayer and Hill and so forth, they are, on Hill Street, they are charging at night. So, and generally they reserve for U of M faculty and staff and students as a primary user. Well, it's a good point because the two systems obviously are in close proximity. And so we're going to land then just on the last section of the discussion, which talk a little bit about our projects, and then maybe we can just sort of have a more general conversation. In the packet, by the way, we have some general information about the parking system. This is that trivia I like to wow people with when I go to parties. Examples about what the revenues look like, how many permits are there. We mentioned the Go Pass. Ridership was up, despite the fact that gas prices are low. We were up 12,000 rides last year, which is pretty impressive. And you get a little bit of the dialogue that we had at our retreat about where we think we're going in the future. It's not just the autonomous and connected and other vehicles. We're also looking at demographic changes. As more of us are millennials and baby boomers, there's going to be less driving, if only because of what the features are of our age groups. We're, for instance, hearing that a lot of young people are not getting driver's licenses. They're going to have a future where they're not going to own a car. So it's the thing that I think most of us talk about, which is where are we going, and I don't know that anybody really knows how many spaces we're going to need in the future, and it's definitely a worthy of discussion topic. That said, some of the projects that we're working on will sort of land here. The parking system got a lot of attention this last year. As you just mentioned, that app came into play. We added another 100+ ePark machines, which made that app even more attractive. So about 3/4 of the system has an electronic parking machine associated with it, which makes that app particularly useful. We finished the garage at 4th and William largely. That's a new stair elevator with 2 high-speed elevators. We did the long-term parking permit policy. Some of the things that we're currently working on is the fencing. We're just finishing up the rooftop fencing at Forest. 5 of the 6 garages now have that rooftop fencing, and so we'll be finishing at Forest. Tomorrow we're going to be opening bids. We had an RFP out for a solar carport project on 4th and Catherine. We heard council during the budget discussion interested with solar. So we're looking to do a small pilot project on 4th and Catherine to see how this works in terms of DTE and other things and learn from it and potentially get to the garages. And then, as we've talked about, the Anna Ashley Garage addition will take up a lot of time this year. We've also been looking at transportation projects. Keith helped to spearhead a circulator study. We were looking at whether or not it's time to revisit the link in the downtown. The Go Pass and Get Downtown is always a part of our operations committee discussion. This year the DDA provided a grant for bike share, and I think there's going to be more dialogue about bike share in the near future. And there was a whole lot of bike hoops installed this summer, adding to our bike facilities. The biggest piece of what our work has been, though, I think in addition to all the parking, has been the streetscape projects. We just finished a partnership project with the city on South U where we modified the streetscape, and I think to some great extent it is much more user-friendly, and certainly things like stormwater management is better managed on South U. We finished the design for 5th and Detroit. That's the area near the farmers market in Zingerman's, and with the city, DDA and the city next year we'll go out to bid. We'll remove the historic brick, fix the utilities underground, restore the historic brick, and we'll be modifying the sidewalk area to gain more pedestrian area. We are, as a piece of that, also providing money for additional lights in the Carytown area outside this project area. A big one we're working on right now is Huron Street. That's a but-for DDA project. That's an unloved street that we all need and use every day. But Huron is very car-centric, and it was once upon a time the feature street in downtown. And what our exploration is looking at is how do we accommodate cars and at the same time weave humans back into it, make it a more pedestrian-friendly street, a safer street. We just this last month selected our consultants for the project after that, which will be First Ashley and William. William would have a protected bike lane associated with it. And First and Ashley, as I mentioned, doesn't have any pedestrian amenities at all, and it's time to take a look at that. And we'll be looking at restoring two-way traffic on both those streets. And then, of course, just ongoing streetscape repairs. And then this is the one that Councilmember Lum landed on, which is there are opportunities ahead for us to think about economic development. With Ann and Ashley, there's an opportunity to use those parking spaces to encourage the investment by the private sector on the lots nearby. We share an interest in affordable housing at all incomes and have to find ways to get more units online. And we have resources, we know the city has resources, and we share an interest in pursuing that. And it's going to be a key element in our, whatever economic development strategy we pursue, is finding a way to have a diversity of people living in our community. And then, as mentioned, this question, since the DDA is at its cap, is there a possibility that we could work collectively to find a way to reinvest some of the monies from whatever project might happen at 415 onto the 415 lot? In particular, that has a TIF capture opportunity that might help fund some of the tree lines. We had some dialogue about how the tree line might have at least some sections that are self-supporting, and that might be one of them. I'll add to this the question the administrator brought us to our board, which was how do we keep going with special events downtown, given the added security costs that we're seeing for these events. That has an economic development benefit to downtown by bringing new audiences downtown, so I would add that to this list. So this is just a thumbnail sketch of some of our projects, but also some areas where there's a commonality. It would be great to see ourselves working together. And that's our last slide.
One potential supply option that I hear rumors about every now and then is whatever the county is going to do with their Main and Ann surface lot. I know that their attention's been, they've had very little bandwidth as a body lately, but some of that stuff may be clearing up. Has there been any additional word from the county on what their intents for that space are, or what the options for collaboration may be?
So I'm not aware of specifics, but I can say that because the DDS is now made the decision to pursue the addition, it gives us the opportunity to have the dialogue with the county to see if in fact there's opportunities. That build out, for instance, might be an area of opportunity. It just, that commercial space, you know, just might have value on both sides for both agencies for more meeting space or more office space. So it begins the opportunity for a more specific dialogue because things are somewhat general.
I can add to that in conversations with the county, we have strongly stated that we don't want to see any more block faces go dark, and that anything in that area should add to the street life of downtown and consider options for workforce housing. So I think we've got a ways to go before we align our thoughts on that property.
I think our
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
How many
Yeah,
feet?
that's right.
Apart? 600.
Yeah, we like banks.
Councilman Westfall.
Thanks. Can I circle back to a couple of
Sure.
details? One is, I heard the possibility for, there was an inference that there might be a possibility to have some kind of differentiation between first-time ticket receipts and repeat offenders. Is that possible to do in our current system? I guess that's more of a question for Mr. Lazarus.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, technology's in place, I would imagine so, but I guess we have to prove that technologically we can do it before we address policy considerations of it.
Yeah, I put it on my to-do list because we've talked about it, just to have the dialogue with city staff to see what it would take to implement it.
Okay. And I guess the other just, you know, should this proposal to add capacity come to us, I did a back of a napkin little something, and I know people hate it when you start off a conversation with back of a napkin. It looks like Carl Walker puts out a parking structure construction pricing sheet every year, and the most recent one, I think they pegged at just under 20,000 a space for Detroit metro area. And I guess, even the most expensive market is New York, at 26,000 a space. And then they say, you know, soft costs are between 15 and 20% on top of that. So generously, that comes out to be about 31,000 per above ground space. And that's for the ground up. That's foundation, elevators, you know, the whole kit and caboodle. So I would assume that adding capacity onto something that already has a foundation, elevators and such would hopefully be less than the most expensive market with the most expensive soft costs. But the back of the napkin says, I think 48,000?
Yeah, I think we're estimating 48, maybe even 50.
Okay.
And some of that, just to clarify, there's a difference between project costs and construction costs. So ours includes the design costs, the engineering. When we issue a bond, we have to include that cost. I don't know if they include that. And their figures may also relate to very large-scale garages. So for instance, at the airport, if you have, I'm just choosing a number, a 10,000 space garage, the cost per space is going to be dramatically less than a very small addition of 375 spaces. Just exponentially more expensive for that elevator because there's not as many spaces to carry that cost. And that's the challenge of these metrics is it doesn't seem like why would we spend 48,000 when it says it should be less, because it's only giving us a piece of what the total puzzle cost will be.
Okay. Yeah, and
Yeah.
you know, I may be more inclined to dig into this than many, so I'll maybe take this offline with your operations committee to learn more about that. That's all I had. Thanks.
Hey, sorry. First, thanks for the presentation tonight. The public parking system and the DDA itself are obviously significant and important operations of the city, so it's great to get together. So thank you. Do you have a request for info? In the past presentations, you had you included more data in your presentation that was always informative and helpful, and you typically had data on actual parking usage for the year, the actual revenues and the volumes for permits and hourly patrons. You had comparisons to budget and to prior year actuals. And then you also typically had helpful trend data on capacity utilization, revenues and costs, both in total and by structure. And then you've also normally included data on demand growth projections for the next few years. So I always found that information helpful, and particularly, as context for these issues that you're bringing forward to us. So whatever form you have this data in, if you could provide that would be great and appreciated. And then just in general, if you could, maybe not tonight, but just educate us on how the fiscal year 17 turned out for the parking system, how fiscal year 18 is, because we're 17, 18 is tracking so far. And then when you expect to have an update of the Nelson Nygaard, type of outlook for demand growth, that would be, and utilization of the parking system going forward. That, I know I'm asking a lot, but
No, that's all important.
That's helpful context.
Yeah, and though we didn't include it in the slideshow, if you look to the back of the packet, we tried to get to all of you, and we'll make sure Jackie has this for Legistar, information about the parking system, including the fiscal year 17 totals for revenues and expenses.
Where's that?
It's
I
in
looked at all
the
your
little
slides.
packet we just put at your seat.
Oh.
We've got information on which structures are net generators to the system, which ones are still being supported by the rest of the system. And just to put on our radar that at least 2 garages, or at least 2 bonds will be retiring in the near term. We touched on the subject of permits because we know that's a topic of great interest, both how many are in current use and then what the current wait list is. And we wanted to point out again, the price differential is one of the things that's driving that, and we're aware of it and have to begin chipping away at it. We note the demand to the extent that we have it, what's driving the demand? The fact that gasoline is still under $3 a gallon is driving demand. That our commercial vacancy is so low. This is 2 years in a row. It's historically low. We also make a note that the number of employees commuting in, which is part of the affordability question. More people are commuting in to go to work, and some are using bus and other modes, but a lot of them are using cars, and that's going to drive demand. So getting our hands around that affordability question has its impact in parking. We note the hourly demand has remained fairly flat over 5 years, but we did want to draw your attention to the fact that last year hourly demand was down 7%. That's a very big drop, and if you look to the back page, you can see the graph taking a little bit of a dip. Some of that's attributable to things like home football games not being the big games they are this year. Some of it is construction changes downtown or some of the big tenants moving out of downtown. But we did want to bring that to your attention, that the line doesn't always go up. On the transportation front, we were very excited to see that GoPass use continues to rise despite the low gas prices. And AATA is seeing almost 90,000 rides a year now with the Air Ride. That's a lot of people that are using this mode of transport to get to the airport, which is that many fewer cars in our downtown. And then we tried to touch on some of the future demand based on what we know. We have not commissioned the update to Nelson Nygaard, so we're still working with what they've given us. But we did try to touch on what we've been talking about in our shop, which is the technology changes on the future and the demographic changes, both of which are going to change what we're seeing today as demand. We need to be mindful that the future won't necessarily look like this going forward. But to that, as the Councilmember Lund has suggested, we'll get other additional data about budget last year, this year. We're going to look to see if we have any other trend data, and then any other data that we've presented in the past that didn't find its way here. We'll include that. Yes.
Sorry, I just can't stop. Back to this, in the appendix here, it also talks about this question of changing the parking maximums, the parking minimums, contribution in lieu. Mr. McKinnon was talking about how, from the developer's side, there's one set of drivers that will create what a developer is seeking for minimum for parking for a use. Mr. McKinnon, from your perspective, or from the DDA board's perspective, to what degree does that, what is it going to take to finance, which is based on what the financiers believe it will take for the site to be successfully used? To what degree does that provide an adequate basis for establishing site-by-site parking requirements? Or do you still see the need for a municipal policy that says whatever your financiers say you need, that's a fine baseline, but we're going to put another requirement on top of that? How do you see those two working together or canceling each other out, et cetera?
I know Susan has said that the DDA's position in the past has been that the requirements of the lender is not the DDA's issue. So that's, I think, the historical position. Is that accurate? I think the other side of that argument is, well, if you want to get anything else built, the lender's position is very important, because without financing, nothing's going to get built. Because I don't know anybody that just comes in and builds a significant development on cash. So I don't know, it's a tough question to answer. It's a good question for this body to discuss, but I
guess part of what I'm saying is there's the question, parking minimums, parking maximums, not regulating it. From your perspective, do you see that there's a public value that is achieved by having the regulation on parking availability that is above and beyond how the financing, if it works right, and we all know it doesn't always work right, but if it works right, would sort of try to right-size the parking for the specific use of that site?
And that's the toughest question, right? If you read the national media, every municipality around the country is dealing with that issue, and many municipalities that get covered by the media are 10x our population, so they're not exactly proxies for Ann Arbor. So we're also near Detroit, where they build cars, And people around here, most people in this room, I bet, have a family member that's worked for the big three. So there's that mentality of car-centric life. I don't know that I have a good answer for you. I mean, it's not all on me to say, but it's really tough to determine what the right answer is there. And I think what you don't want to do is be 20 years down the road and have a lot of large buildings with no parking and have our population grow to the point where we do have logjam traffic. That would be unfortunate. And I think we talk about wanting to do more pedestrian-oriented development, and that's all great, but everybody that walked in today, it's getting colder, and over the next 6 months, not many people are going to want to spend long periods of time on their bike or walking. Some people will, but the reality is that they're young, old, and infirm people that just can't do that. It's not realistic for them. So there's a whole lot of variables there for sure.
I think the challenge is for us to then come back to what are the goals that we have for the community and what do we have for downtown. And if it's a goal toward multimodal, if it's a goal toward walkability, that isn't necessarily compatible with parking minimums. It might be something that at least we should have a dialogue about parking maximums from the perspective of zoning. What financing might require to make a project successful may also change as time changes and where the project comes in and where it goes. For instance, our building was built, where the DDA office is located, it was built as a condominium that failed, and 2/3 of it is office, and one part of it's restaurant. So I don't know if the parking that might have been required for the condominiums would still be needed if it were in its present use. It changes.
Further questions or discussion?
Just an observation. This reminds me of 20-plus years ago, Ed Servell at a planning commission meeting said, when did parking minimums become maximums? We've been living with that approach all these decades later. He said that sometime in the 90s, and I will never forget that comment. And yeah, you look at every site plan that's approved, and yeah, the minimum is the max. And I think there's a cumulative effect of that. So we're just another perspective.
I just want to express my enthusiasm to go. Just maybe we can finish on a positive note. Really excited about the protected bike lane. Really, really excited about that, as well as the idea of getting First and Ashley to going two-way. I think that's going to go a lot to making our downtown more desirable, but also work towards our goals of pedestrian safety. So thank you for including those in your plan.
Thank you.
Any further questions or discussion? Okay, so it serves as closing, then if not, but if someone else has something else to say, that's great. I'd just like to thank DDA for coming, and thank DDA members, of course, too, for coming and joining us today. Parking is obviously an intersection of all sorts of different things. It is something that we need in order to keep our downtown vital, but also, it takes up one of our most precious assets, and that is land and space downtown for a secondary need. No one comes downtown for the exciting purpose of parking.
No.
And so there's always a balance there, and of course, too, the parking, at least in most of its incarnations, expresses a mode of transport that is not entirely socially desirable. Electrics aside, we'd all like to be out of our cars if we can for a wide variety of reasons. So it's a good conversation to have, and it's always going to be a tension. Whether or not, and I think Councilmember Borbahowski raised a good question, whether or not the sort of the hive mind of the financing market identifies what the market wants and what is proper with respect to the market with respect to parking, and whether we overlay our own interests and desires upon that is something we've certainly been doing. Whether we need to continue it is an open and reasonable question, but a hard one too. So, thanks everybody.
Yeah, thank you. So with your permission, as we close, if you want to allow for public comment, Joe and I will step aside.
Absolutely. We now come to public comment general time. Public comment general time is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to council and the community, and of course the DDA, about matters of municipal interest. To speak at public comment general time, one need not have signed up in advance. Speakers have 3 minutes in which to speak, so please pay attention to the beeping that's going to come behind you when our indomitable city clerk identifies that 3 minutes have expired. As a matter of courtesy, we have only one person speaking at a time, and if you require insistence speaking before us, we'd be delighted to provide it to you. Is there anyone who'd like to speak at public comment?
Hi, my name is Everett Gometti. I walk downtown to work or take the bus. I want to make a comment about the city's Complete Streets program and how it relates to parking and how we finance the various sorts of winter activities that go on in the city. There's a substantial public effort made to clear the streets when it snows. There's a substantial DDA effort. You see Republic Park trucks clearing surface parking lots, whatnot. But the maintenance of our sidewalks has been privatized to a large degree. Property owners are expected to keep their property sidewalks clear. Not everywhere. There's some exceptions to that. But the place where everyone falls down is at the corners. The corner of the street is simultaneously a public space and a private space. There's a little interface there. If the snow melts, it becomes a stormwater problem, and that's a separate, completely separate organization responsible for stormwater than snow. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we look at parking in isolation and think of all the things we're doing to get people downtown, and then fail to make it possible for them to cross the street without getting their feet wet. And winter's coming. We know that. And I just want to make sure that as we think of a complete parking system, we go all the way over the curb, get people out of their cars, onto their feet without making it be more of a problem than it needs to be. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Nagurney. I'm very impressed with how complex parking is, but there was a question that was raised at the beginning of this meeting that was not addressed, and that concerns me. And that was the question about the implication of allowing private developers to have parking spaces which require the city to then build extra parking. The core spaces lot downtown is going to require 3 more stories on the First and Ashley lot. It's going to cost a lot of money. That is, as was stated by one of the council people, transferring the cost of that parking from the private developer to the city. And I'm just disappointed that nobody has addressed this issue tonight. And I think that should be considered and discussed. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak at public comment? Seeing no one, public comment is closed. We are adjourned. Thank you.